Welcome everyone to today's press conference. My name is Gerald Cuinn, Director of GLAN, the Global Legal Action Network. GLAN works to pursue innovative legal actions across borders, and in doing so we challenge those powerful actors involved with serious human rights violations and systemic injustice. One of our 4 areas of focus is in economic and environmental justice, and our organization has, since its foundation, understood climate change to be the greatest threat to the human rights of our generation, posing a serious risk to the lives and well-being of individuals across the world. In 2017, we began working with a committed group of young people from Portugal who wanted to take a stand on the climate crisis. They were responding to the worst forest fires in living memory, fires which ripped through forests, homes, and resulted in the deaths of 120 people. This disaster brought the reality of climate change home. It was now on their doorstep, and they were acutely aware that their present and future well-being were being put in jeopardy. This was the starting point of a conversation that set in motion an ambitious legal case against multiple European states whose emissions are directly harming their lives. Today, they are filing what is an unprecedented case against 33 countries with the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. Today, we are joined by the 6 children and young adults bringing the case. We have with us Katarina, Cláudia, Martim, and Mariana, all of whom are from Leiria, one of the regions worst affected by the catastrophic wildfires which hit Portugal in 2017. Sofia and André are in Lisbon. They are also feeling the effects of rising heat extremes. In fact, during the preparation of this case, they experienced a new temperature record of 44 degrees Celsius, which was set in the summer of 2018. You will hear first a brief statement from 3 of these youth applicants on their motivations for bringing the case. Next, you will hear from Gerry Liston, legal officer with GLAN, who has led our work in supporting these youth applicants. He will also give a snapshot of the evidence that underpins their case and outline GLAN's overall strategic objective in supporting them. Finally, we will hear from Marc QC from Garden Court Chambers, who is lead counsel on this case. He will also mention the other barristers who have contributed to this work. We will try to keep these contributions brief and leave as much time for Q&A, which I will moderate. Also on standby will be Rita Mota, a legal researcher with GLAN, and Barrister Paul Clark, both of whom were instrumental in the building of this case. Please refrain from using the chat function unless you have technical difficulties. But before handing over to the young people behind this case, it is important to address our current context and address why the climate crisis ought to be considered through the world-altering lens of COVID-19, a pandemic where governments have taken robust action and, for the most part, heeded the advice from scientists. Governments know that a climate catastrophe is around the corner. They know what needs to be done to prevent it, and they have the means to do so. Yet, governments around the world, including European governments, are still failing to take the necessary action. And this is the context in which we are helping to file this case. Thank you, and I will now hand over to Cláudia in Leiria.
Sou Cláudia, tenho 21 anos, sou de Leiria e sou estudante de enfermagem. Resolvi participar neste caso porque as alterações climáticas são a maior ameaça ao meu futuro e ao futuro da minha geração. Eu cresci no campo e talvez por isso adoro estar em espaços abertos e sinto-me livre quando estou no meio da natureza. Em 2017, assisti com horror aos incêndios florestais mortíferos que destruíram várias zonas do país, incluindo a região de Leiria. Felizmente, nem eu nem a minha família ou amigos fomos diretamente prejudicados. Mas foi avassalador para mim ver como as florestas, onde normalmente adoro estar, de repente se tornaram locais extremamente perigosos. Nesse momento, percebi claramente que as alterações climáticas estão a fazer do mundo um lugar cada vez mais perigoso e que a minha geração está cada vez mais vulnerável e sem perspectivas de futuro. A crise provocada pela Covid-19 lembra-nos que, como espécie, somos muito vulneráveis. Temos que aprender com esta situação e reconhecer que nós, e especialmente a minha geração, corremos o risco de não ter condições para viver, ou mesmo sobreviver. A verdade é que as alterações climáticas são uma crise de saúde pública. A nossa saúde depende da saúde do meio ambiente em que vivemos. Sabemos que as catástrofes naturais e as ondas de calor extremo vão matar cada vez mais pessoas. Portanto, precisamos de sair da crise da Covid-19 com muito mais resiliência que antes. Precisamos de uma recuperação saudável. E, para isso, não chega a reconhecer que a emergência climática existe. Se os governos querem verdadeiramente restaurar a saúde pública, têm de agir imediatamente e com a urgência que a ciência comprova. É absolutamente claro. Uma recuperação saudável requer ações radicais para combater as alterações climáticas. Obrigada.
Thank you, Cláudia. And now we hand over to Katarina, and hopefully I should say that everyone can access, as you may see in the bottom right-hand side, the translation channels. So I'll hand over now to Katarina.
Olá a todos, sou a Catarina, tenho 20 anos, vivo numa aldeia perto de Leiria e gostaria de explicar brevemente a razão pela qual estou envolvida neste caso. Estou com medo do meu futuro. Infelizmente, já estamos a ver os efeitos das alterações climáticas na minha região. Este verão, estamos novamente a ter ondas de calor extremas que estão a tornar o novo normal. Tal como a maioria das pessoas, eu gosto de passar tempo ao ar livre e de praticar exercício na rua. Ultimamente, é simplesmente impossível fazer exercício ao ar livre, dado o calor extremo que se faz sentir. Se isto acontecesse apenas alguns dias por ano, durante o verão, estava tudo bem, mas as ondas de calor já se estão a tornar cada vez mais extremas e recorrentes. Vivo com a sensação de que todos os anos a minha casa se torna um lugar mais hostil e tenho consciência que, à medida que envelhecer, serei exposta a ondas de calor violentas que irão durar várias semanas. Isso assusta-me imenso, porque não sei o que será do meu futuro. Se tiver filhos, para que tipo de mundo os trarei? Estas são as preocupações reais com as quais vivo todos os dias. A minha mensagem é simples. Infelizmente, agora estamos em crise. Mas, felizmente, a maior parte do mundo está a seguir o conselho dos cientistas para combater este vírus. No entanto, os governos não estão a fazer o que a ciência exige no que diz respeito à luta contra as alterações climáticas. A crise atual apresenta aos nossos governos uma oportunidade para garantirem que recuperemos não só desta crise, mas também da crise climática. Apenas uma recuperação verde da crise da Covid-19 é uma verdadeira recuperação. Isto significa que os governos devem investir o suficiente em tecnologias verdes para acabar, de uma vez por todas, com a nossa dependência dos combustíveis fósseis que ameaçam o futuro da minha geração. É urgente haver uma redução rápida das emissões de gases do efeito estufa, o que para a União Europeia significa nada menos do que reduzir as suas emissões em 65% até 2030.
Thank you, Katarina. We now hand over to Sofia.
Olá, sou Sofia, tenho 15 anos e vivo a sul de Lisboa. Decidi participar nesta ação porque sinto que a minha geração tem mesmo de prestar atenção ao que está a passar no nosso planeta e começar a se preocupar-se mais com o clima e o desaparecimento da natureza. Tristemente, os efeitos das alterações climáticas são cada vez mais visíveis, com ondas de calor que fazem faltar água e afetam a produção de alimentos, o ar demasiado quente e seco que nos impede de sair de casa durante as piores horas e, claro, aos incêndios violentos que nos dão enorme ansiedade pelo sofrimento que causam a quem vive nestas áreas e nos fazem ter medo de viajar pelas florestas do nosso país. Mesmo os efeitos na saúde, como por exemplo, o meu irmão André é asmático e se corre 5 minutos ao ar livre, com muito calor, fica com falta de ar e demasiado quente, o que me preocupa muito, porque em dias normais ele é imparável. Por vezes penso, se as alterações climáticas já são tão extremas em 2020, como é que será o futuro próximo se nós não fizermos nada? Este ano vou para o 10º ano e escolhi a área Ciências Naturais. Descobri recentemente a Química Verde e fiquei mesmo interessada nessa área, onde se podem desenvolver novos materiais e componentes que nos ajudem a largar de vez os combustíveis fósseis e deixá-los onde devem estar, debaixo da terra, mais de milhões de anos. Porque agora é hora de parar com as emissões e construir alternativas que ajudem a recuperar o planeta, em vez de nos pôr cada vez em mais perigo. Para que isso aconteça, nós precisamos de ajuda dos nossos governos para conseguirmos fazer alguma coisa prática. A minha mensagem é simples. Acredito que juntos somos mais fortes e as nossas vozes tornam-se mais poderosas. Ainda há esperança. Obrigada.
Thank you, Sofia, and thank you very much for those statements from the 3 youth applicants. That was excellent. And I'd like now to hand over to Gwillers, QC. Apologies, we're not going to Marc Willers. We're actually going to Gerry Liston, Legal Officer of the Global Legal Action Network. Sorry about that, Marc.
Thanks, Gearóid. So you've just heard about how climate change is already impacting the lives of Cláudia, Katarina, and Sofia, and about the fears that they have for their futures. And let me just share with you some of the really quite terrifying projections from our expert evidence about what the future currently holds for them. They are facing the very real possibility of living to see a 4-degree warmer world. And in Portugal, that's a world where extreme heat waves with temperatures of over 40 degrees Celsius could endure for over 30 days at a time, where the number of days that there's an extreme risk of forest fires quadruples in some parts of the country, rising to up to 80 or 90 days per year. And these heat extremes are deadly. If we remain on our current path, a staggering 30 times more people are expected to be killed by heat waves in Western Europe in the final 3 decades of this century. The reality is that European governments are responsible for contributing to this climate crisis. Not only are they not doing enough to cut their own greenhouse gas emissions, they are also failing to take responsibility for the ways in which they contribute to emissions beyond their borders. For example, through their export of fossil fuels, or by giving fossil fuel companies the freedom to continue drilling across the globe. These failures violate the most basic human rights of all those who stand to suffer the devastating effects of the climate crisis. Indeed, they pose a threat to human rights law itself, because as one UN expert has said, human rights might not survive the upheaval that climate change is currently on course to cause. So this is the first time that the Strasbourg court will be called on to address an issue which puts in jeopardy the very system of law upon which it is established. I've had the privilege of working with Katarina, Cláudia, Martim, Mariana, Sofia, and André in supporting them in bringing this case. And I just want to acknowledge the courage and the bravery that they are demonstrating here today, because it goes without saying that they would much prefer not to have to take this case. But like so many ordinary people and activists across Europe and across the world, they know that they have no choice but to do what they can do to force governments into taking the action that is so urgently needed. Today, they are bringing their case to Europe's highest human rights court. Decisions of the European Court of Human Rights are legally binding and have the power to change how governments act. Building on the calls of campaigners worldwide, they are seeking a decision that compels governments across Europe to heed the science and take the action that is urgently needed to avoid a climate catastrophe.
Thank you, Gerry. And now we hand over to Marc Willers in London. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm lead counsel representing this group of children and young adults. I'm a member of Garden Court Chambers in London, and I'm delighted and indeed privileged to be working on this crucial climate change case, together with 4 other barristers, colleagues of mine at Garden Court Chambers. They are Paul Clark, Richard Reynolds, Irena Sabic, and Ella Gunn. I'm here to explain how the failure of the respondent governments to tackle climate change affects the human rights of these youth applicants and others of their generation. The climate crisis threatens 3 specific human rights of the youth applicants that are protected by the European Convention on Human Rights. They are the right to life, protected by Article 2 of the Convention, the right to respect for their private and family rights, which is protected by Article 8 of the Convention, and the right not to be discriminated against in the enjoyment of those convention rights, which is protected by Article 14 of the Convention. Put bluntly, climate change affects the applicant's right to life because it increases their chances of dying prematurely. The forest fires, which killed over 100 people in Portugal in 2017, and which, as our expert evidence makes clear, were exacerbated by climate change, demonstrate that their lives and the lives of others in Portugal are at a very real and grave risk. And that threat to their right to life stands to worsen significantly over the course of their lifetimes. Climate change also affects their right to respect for their privacy and their family lives, that right being protected, as I said, under Article 8 of the Convention. It's a right which covers both their physical and mental well-being. You've heard them describe their real, indeed enormous anxiety about their futures. This impact on their mental well-being is a clear-cut infringement of their Article 8 rights. And they are also experiencing the effects that increased heat extremes are already having on their ability to sleep and take exercise outdoors. A point which is of particular concern to those who have underlying health conditions. These 2 amount to a clear infringement of their Article 8 rights. Finally, we're arguing that the European states are unlawfully discriminating against these children and young adults by failing to properly tackle the climate crisis. This is because they stand to experience the worst effects of climate change for the obvious reason that they will live longer than the older people amongst us. People like many of the lawyers involved in the case, and I suspect some of the journalists. There's no justification for European governments to force them and other young people to bear this burden. Our case is that European governments are wrongly discriminating against the youth applicants by failing to properly tackle the climate emergency with the required degree of urgency. Our key aim in bringing this case is to persuade the European Court of Human Rights to provide an urgently needed direction to the member states of the Council of Europe that the human right to a safe and healthy environment requires them to take all necessary steps to address the climate emergency. We're seeking to build on the truly historic precedent set by the Agenda decision in the Netherlands, where its Supreme Court ordered that the Dutch government goes further than the emissions reductions it had committed to undertake. The court did so precisely because it held that the European Convention on Human Rights required the Dutch government to take measures to counter the threat of dangerous climate change. We're seeking a ruling from the European Court of Human Rights in this case that states are obliged to adopt emission cuts that are collectively consistent with the 1.5 degrees C target of the Paris Agreement. If the court issues such a direction, then that will further empower individuals who bring cases in domestic courts throughout Europe, seeking decisions which force their governments to tackle the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marc. And thanks to everyone who contributed just now. We are now good to move to questions and answers. And they can be submitted by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And I will be moderating the questions and welcome any queries that are coming in. Katia, hopefully I'm looking at the right space here. I see there are currently no open questions. Is that correct?
Yes, there is no questions until now.
Okay. So we can kick off this phase of the press conference. If anyone has any questions, please take your time and enter them, and we will pass them out to the participants. Okay. So here we have our first question. Hello, readers are going to ask straight away, how can a 12-year-old take someone to court? What are the legal procedures in this? This question I will pass over to Gerry.
Thanks, Gearóid. Well, as you know, the applicants in this case, a number of them are minors. As Marc mentioned, a feature of our case is the way in which climate change, the burden of climate change falls greater on younger people just because they stand to live for a longer period of time, and that climate change will worsen over the course of their lifetimes, and particularly into the later parts of this century. In terms of the, I think the question was directed slightly towards the formal procedural side of things and how a young person is able to participate in a case like this. Well, they have victim status under the European Convention on Human Rights on the basis of the impacts that climate change is having on them. Of course, for the younger participants, their parents their parents consent to their participation in the case, and that is what enables them formally to bring the case against these countries to the European Court of Human Rights.
Great, thank you, Gerry. The next question is the idea how long we have to wait until there is a decision. I might pass this one to Marc.
Thank you, Gerald. The European Court of Human Rights does have a history of taking an inordinate length of time to determine cases brought before it. But we are going to be asked that this case be expedited for the obvious reason that we're in the midst of a climate emergency, and we need the direction that we seek from the court at the first available opportunity. That said, we are bringing the case against 33 member states, and with due process and the need for those member states to respond to our case, and then the matter to be determined at an admissibility stage, and then we hope at a trial stage, at a substantive hearing. I mean, we could still be looking at a matter of certainly more than months and possibly a year or so before we get a decision from the European Court on any of those issues.
Thank you, Marc. And the next question is, doesn't the court have jurisdiction in more than 33 countries? I might hand this one back to Gerry. And we also are happy to accept questions from the youth applicants themselves. So if you have questions you'd like to direct to them, please don't hesitate. Gerry, I'll hand that question to you.
Sure. So there are 47 member states of the Council of Europe. This case obviously is brought against 33 of those members. We've decided to focus on the major emitters within the Council of Europe. So if you take the member states of the EU as a bloc, and then Russia, Turkey, Ukraine, the United Kingdom, Switzerland, and Norway, they make up the major emitters within the Council of Europe.
Thank you, Gerry. I have some questions from outside Zoom, which I might pass to André. Give me 1 second. André, we have a question here from social media on what is it that you want governments to do? Would you care to take that?
Obrigado, Gearóid. A razão principal é que eu queria que nós todos queríamos que os governos ouvissem de vez os seus cientistas, porque os cientistas podem ter soluções para melhorar o nosso futuro. Mas se quiserem uma resposta mais concreta, queríamos que o Tribunal imponha aos países a definição de políticas, ações concretas e com datas, e baixar os impactos das alterações climáticas.
Thank you, André. We have another question here. Regarding the ruling you're seeking, do you want the court to back up the Paris Agreement targets? Gerry, I'll pass that one to you.
Thanks, Gearóid. Yes, this case, the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degrees is a central feature of this case. And as Marc mentioned, what we're seeking is a decision that requires European governments to adopt emissions cuts that are collectively consistent with ensuring that Europe's contribution to the global effort to tackle climate change is consistent with that 1.5 degree target. So yes, we see this case as buttressing the Paris Agreement.
Thank you, Gerry. Another question via social media is a question I might direct this to Martim. Again, it's what is it you want to governments, what would you like to see governments doing, and what role does the administration of fossil fuels play in this? And does this case have any relevance to you for the management of fossil fuels?
A gestão dos combustíveis fósseis tem, claro, importância para nós, visto que grande parte das emissões de gases de efeito de estufas são por causa dos combustíveis fósseis. E, como o André disse, nós queremos que os governos ouçam o que os cientistas têm a dizer para que isto deixe de ser um problema.
Great, thank you, Martim. Another question that's come through on chat, if we could keep the questions through the Q&A function, that would be great, and leave the chat for technical. Why file a new complaint compared to one filed by 16 young people, including Greta Thunberg, in September before the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child? Is this complaint more likely to succeed? Maybe, so really a question about what is unique about this case and its likelihood of success. I might send this back to Gerry, and if there's any follow-up comments from Marc.
Sure. Well, the first thing to say is that we see our case as reinforcing the petition brought by the petitioners in the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child complaint, and vice versa. Also, the domestic cases going on throughout both Europe and indeed beyond, we see as reinforcing litigation at the international and regional level, and also international and regional litigation reinforcing the domestic efforts. In terms of likelihood of success, well, these courts and bodies tend to be very much motivated by the practical effects on human rights that they are confronted with, in particular complaints and petitions, etc. And the evidence is just so overwhelmingly strong that, as Marc pointed out, the extent of the interferences with the various human rights, both under the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the European Convention on Human Rights, and indeed all international and regional human rights treaties, or most of them at least. So we see them as having an equal likelihood of success.
I would just echo what Gerry said. Bear in mind the complaint that the 6 youth applicants are bringing before the European Court of Human Rights is based upon European Convention rights, whereas the complaint filed by Greta Thunberg and others is filed in respect of issues under the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child. We will be relying on that convention too, but fundamentally our case is based upon violations of Articles 2, 8 and 14 of the European Convention. So that is a distinction between the two cases, but I agree with Gerry that the underlying scientific evidence it ought to support both, and both cases should are consistently argued and will be supportive of each other.
Great, thank you, Marc and Gerry. We now have another question via social media. How did the 2000 forest fires affect you? I might direct this one to Katarina.
Obrigada. Então, antes de mais, os incêndios de 2017 foram bastante próximos daqui da minha região, em Leiria, e obviamente nos afetaram fisicamente. Tínhamos bastante fumo na zona, inclusive a minha escola foi fechada para irmos para casa. Para além disso, perdemos muita vegetação, é bastante visível a quantidade de vegetação de pinhal que ardeu, e em termos físicos é isso. Para além disso, todas as pessoas se afetam em termos respiratórios e em termos psicológicos, porque é aterrorizador ter um incêndio mesmo perto das nossas casas. Depois dos incêndios, percebemos claramente que é preciso mudar, e penso que seja essencialmente o nosso ponto de partida de que é urgente mudar e travar as alterações climáticas.
Great, thank you, Katarina. The next question again from social media. I might direct this one to Cláudia. Did your parents push you into taking this case? Cláudia.
Não. Os nossos pais apoiam-nos bastante ao intentar a ação, mas nunca nos forçaram a nada, dão-nos o apoio necessário, que é o que nós precisamos deles para isso, para nos apoiarem.
Okay, thank you, Cláudia. Next question I have is a legal question. Will there be a defense argument, and by whom? Gerry, I might pass this to you.
Yes, so the next phase of the case will be responding to the defences of all of the 33 countries, as Marc mentioned, firstly on questions relating to what's called the admissibility of the case, so whether the case can actually proceed to a substantive merits hearing, and then assuming we progress beyond that stage, those countries again will file defences or responses addressing those merits issues.
Thank you, Gerry. Another question for the applicants. What changes are you making to your lifestyles to help the environment? So looking beyond this case and your own personal lives, I suppose. I'll hand this question to Sofia, please.
Obrigada, Gerry. O que nós esperamos é nós escolhemos mais alimentos locais e da estação e somos mais cuidadosos com o uso de água e energia, mas as grandes mudanças têm de ser promovidas pelos governos e essa é a base da nossa ação.
Thank you very much. Let me just see, I've got another question coming in from social media. Filter these. Okay, we have another question on how did you become involved in this case? I might put this to Katarina, and if there's any additional comments that Rita would like to make, feel free.
Ok, eu vou começar e depois a Rita completa a minha resposta. Basicamente, a Rita é prima do Martim, da Cláudia e da Mariana. Eu sou vizinha e amiga de família deles os três. Para além disso, a Rita é amiga da família do André e da Sofia. E basicamente, a Rita conheceu este caso, estava integrada e falou disso a eles. Depois, mais tarde, a Cláudia falou comigo e eu entrei no caso. Essa é a minha explicação. E a partir daí começámos a conhecer-nos e a ser amigos. Podes completar, Rita.
Sim, olá, obrigada. Portanto, isto acabou por surgir de uma forma bastante orgânica. Em 2017 eu estava a colaborar com a GLAN e o Gerry e o Gearóid falaram de hipóteses que estavam a explorar sobre como usar a lei para combater as alterações climáticas. E nesse mesmo ano eu fui passar férias a Portugal, que é o meu país de origem, e dei-me conta que as pessoas que eu conhecia e de quem eu gosto, que vivem no meu país, estavam extremamente preocupadas com as alterações climáticas e com os efeitos que elas iriam ter no nosso país e na vida, sobretudo das crianças e dos jovens. E em conversas com os meus amigos e a minha família, eu falei-lhes deste trabalho que estava a ser feito na GLAN para tentar explorar formas de agir, e eles chegaram-se à frente, quiseram trabalhar connosco para trazer um caso que pudesse fazer alguma diferença no que diz respeito ao impacto das alterações climáticas. E pronto, eu apresentei-os à GLAN e começou tudo a partir daí.
Great, thank you, Katarina and Rita. We have another question on social media. Why are you attacking countries, especially countries that are trying to take measures to reduce their emissions? I might pass this one to André.
Ok, obrigado. O que eu sinto e que nós todos sentimos é que o mundo inteiro está debaixo de perigo, incluindo os países que afirmam que nós estamos a atacar. porque nós não estamos a atacar de todo, nós estamos a dar oportunidade, que é para os países fazerem mais e melhor pelos compromissos que têm que assumir, ou seja, baixar os impactos das alterações climáticas. É só uma oportunidade que estamos a dar a todos, não é um ataque.
Great, thank you very much. André, I think that's it with questions on my end. Unless there's something else on the Q&A for the participants, now is your time, but I think we are good to draw things to a conclusion otherwise. Would any of the participants like to put in a final comment before we decide to wrap up?
Perhaps I could just say this, that our generation is burning fossil fuel, making profit out of doing so, and leaving the mess behind for the youth applicants and other members of their generation to clear up. And that's just not fair. It's not just, it's not equitable. And the European Court of Human Rights, we would argue, needs to make that clear to these member states.
Great, thank you, Marc. Another legal question is, how do we expect admissibility to be handled, in particular, given the exhaustion of domestic remedies required in all member states? Gerry, I don't know if you want to add anything to what you've said already.
Sure. So yes, I suppose the standard rule is that applicants are required to exhaust domestic remedies in the domestic courts of the countries that they're proceeding against before bringing their case to Strasbourg. In this case, there is of course an exception to that rule. And in this case, obviously it's being brought against 33 countries. Our argument is that it would be an unreasonable burden on a group of 6 children and young adults to bring proceedings and take them through the domestic courts of all 33 countries. There's also an urgency argument. We need, as Marc said, a direction from the Strasbourg court so that domestic courts can then implement that decision in a consistent way throughout Europe and provide the kind of binding orders like the Dutch courts in the Urgenda case provided on a consistent basis throughout Europe, as I said previously, in order to ensure that Europe's contribution is collectively consistent with the 1.5 degree target.
Excellent, thank you, Gerry. I think that wraps everything up. I just let participants know that the website is now live for this case, which is www.youthforclimatejustice.org, and I'll put that in chat and break my own rule. And this will contain additional press materials, and we will put a recording of this press conference on that site. So please see the media section for, as I said, extra documentation, including the application that has been put before the court. And without taking more of your time, I think we are good to wrap up. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and to all of the participants for their excellent contributions.